welcome to this lesson about the FINRA Series 65 exam. Today, our lesson is about economic factors and business information, so basic economic concepts that you will need to know. So let's go ahead and introduce you to what we're going to talk about in this lesson. This is one of the very key areas that's tested on the Series 65 exam. In today's lesson, we'll focus specifically on basic economic concepts, which fall under the first major exam section. This section of the exam ensures that you understand how macroeconomic forces, government policies, and global developments influence investment markets and decision-making. By the end of this lesson, you will be confident in your understanding of the phases of the business cycle, the difference between monetary and fiscal policy, the impact of global factors on domestic economies, including currency valuation, sovereign debt, and geopolitical events. So let's go ahead and dive in. And as in with all the lessons, at the end, you will have a chance to test yourself to make sure you are ready to move on to the next lesson. So first, let's talk about the business cycle. So the business cycle refers to the natural rise and fall of economic growth over time. And it consists of four main phases: the expansion, the peak, the contraction or recession, and the trough. So let's talk about each one of those four phases so that you make sure you understand. So first, expansion. This is characterized by increasing GDP, more employment, more consumer spending, and more production. So things are going really well with your economy, and everybody is here for it. Then we reach what we call the peak. So this is the high point of economic activity before the downturn begins. So you can think of it kind of like a roller coaster. It goes up and up and up all the way to the top, and then it slowly hits the peak, and then it starts down again. So at this point, unemployment is low, but inflation may be a growing concern. Inflation is one of the things that can cause an economy to go in the wrong direction and to tighten up. So central banks then may tighten monetary policy to prevent overheating. So they want to take money out of the economy so that the economy doesn't overheat. And so that naturally leads to phase 3, a contraction or recession. This is a period of declining economic activity that lasts for more than a few months. So you might hear this on the news saying, oh, the economy is in a recession. That's what we're talking about. So there's a downturn in the economy for more than a few months. During a recession, GDP decreases, unemployment rises, and consumer confidence drops, which means people are not out there buying things. They're going to save their money for times when things are better. So fewer people are buying, there's more unemployment, GDP is shrinking. That's a recession. And then we hit the trough. And the trough is the low point where recovery begins. This means that you start to see economic indicators begin to improve, like your unemployment will stabilize so that it's not going down anymore. Your inflation is okay. You might say, okay, people are starting to get jobs again. The GDP is going back up. So this is often marked by accommodative monetary and fiscal policy. So instead, they want to go ahead and ease off that taking money out of the economy so that there's enough to go around, and we can help this cycle get going again. And so then we get back into the expansion phase, which goes up to the peak, eventually hits a contraction, and goes down to the trough. So as you can see, it just is a continuous roller coaster of up and down. But so why does all of this matter? That's a really good question. So why this matters? Investors, advisors, and portfolio managers monitor the business cycle to adjust asset allocations. There's something they watch very carefully to see where things are headed. For instance, defensive stocks, such as utilities, perform better in recessions, while cyclicals, consumer discretionary stocks, thrive during expansions. And so you think about it a little bit like, yeah, that makes sense. So if it's consumer discretionary and there's an expansion, that means people are out, they're spending money, their consumer confidence is high. Of course, those stocks would do better. But then there's these defensive stocks that are just kind of not based on discretionary spending are going to do better in a recession. So that's just one example of many of why you would want to make sure to keep an eye on the business cycle. Make sure you know kind of where the economy is sitting at any given time. Or, I guess sitting is the wrong word. It doesn't really ever sit. It's always moving in one direction or another. And so which direction is it tending toward? All right, let's shift gears and talk a little bit about monetary and fiscal policies. We mentioned that a little bit when we were talking about the cycle, but let's go ahead and flesh that out a bit. So understanding how governments influence the economy is critical for advisors. So that's why we're talking about monetary and fiscal policies. That's how the government puts its finger on the scale, so to speak, and tries to nudge the economy in one direction or another. Like if it's overheating, they try to cool it down. If it's sluggish, they try to warm things up, so to speak. So there's a couple different ways that the government can do this. The first is monetary policy, which is controlled by a nation's central bank. In the United States, that's the Federal Reserve. So the goal is to control inflation, manage employment, and stabilize the currency. I mean, it's a big ask. And that's why it's kind of hard too. So sometimes they try things and they don't work. And so they try another little interest rate cut here and a little something else there. And that doesn't work. And so, they just have to kind of experiment with it. There's a lot of things they can do to try to decide what is best. But yeah, even in the best circumstances, an economy is such a complex thing that it's even hard for governments to figure out. So they have a few tools at their disposal, however. One is open market operations. This means that they're buying and selling government securities to influence the money supply. How much money is there versus how much is not. So if there's an inflationary cycle, you want less money out in the economy. And if things are sluggish, you want to push more money out into the economy. They can also adjust the discount rates. And so this is the interest rate that's charged to banks for borrowing reserves. So if the discount rate is low, then banks can pass that on to their customers and vice versa. So if that is too high, then banks aren't feeling too good about that. They can pass that on to the customers that they deal with. We also have reserve requirements. And this is the requirement on banks that says they have to keep a percentage of deposits in reserve. And so if banks have to keep more in reserve, then that takes money out of the economy. So that's one way they can take money out. If you lower that, then banks are able to then unlock that money and get it back out into the economy. So those are three different tools that, for example, the Federal Reserve can use in order to try to nudge the economy in one direction or another. So we talk about expansionary policy. That's when they want to lower interest rates and increase the money supply to stimulate growth. So if we're in the trough, they're probably going to try to do expansionary policy. When COVID-19 hit, the Federal Reserve had to tried to do some pretty drastic things, lowering rates left and right and just trying to do anything to stimulate the economy that was really, really in trouble. And then we have contractionary policy. This is when the Federal Reserve is raising rates, reducing the money supply to combat inflation. So if the economy is overheating and inflation is is too much month on month, then they want to get fewer dollars in the economy, so they do things to take money out of the supply. So on the test itself, you will be expected to differentiate between these two, know who controls them, and recognize how they influence the economy and investment decisions. So that's what you need to know about those. Next, I'd like to talk about global factors. In a globalized world, economic and investment decisions are not made in isolation. Here are key global factors that affect domestic and international markets. 1. Currency valuation and effective exchange rates. Currency values fluctuate based on supply and demand, central bank actions, interest rates, trade balances, and political stability. So if you have a strong domestic currency, say like in the United States, it's the dollar, this makes imports cheaper and exports more expensive. And so this can hurt export-driven industries. If you have a weak domestic currency, so if the value of the dollar is dropping, then this makes exports cheaper and more competitive abroad, and then can lead to inflation as import prices rise. So it's kind of like the economic cycle, like there's some winners and some losers at any time in the economic cycle. There are certain parts of the economy that will do better when the economy is doing different things. You might hear the term effective exchange rate, or EER. So this is a weighted average of a country's currency relative to a basket of foreign currencies. It reflects the overall competitiveness, not just the bilateral rate. So if you hear EER, that's the effective exchange rate. So how is this relevant to investing? So currency risk impacts foreign investments, international revenue streams that some companies have, and global asset allocation. For example, investing in a foreign stock may yield losses if the foreign currency weakens relative to the dollar. So that is something you also need to have your finger on the pulse of. Next, I'd like to mention sovereign debt. So sovereign debt refers to government-issued debt, such as treasury bonds or foreign government bonds. So the United States issues bonds all the time. So this is something that is a big factor, say, in the economy of the United States. High debt levels can raise concerns about a country's ability to repay, impacting its credit rating. So the national debt gets higher and higher, then it might be like, oh, are they going to be able to repay this? A sovereign debt crisis, like Greece had in 2010, can lead to global ripple effects, impacting banking systems and international markets. So the bigger the player in the international economy, the bigger the effects are going to be. So Greece had an effect on the global markets, but since it's not this massive economic superpower, it wasn't as big as it could have been. Investors analyze a country's debt-to-GDP ratio and credit ratings from agencies like Moody's or Standard & Poor's, S&Ps, to assess risk. So this is something that a good investor will also have their finger on. Sovereign bonds are common investments in diversified portfolios, so different kinds of government bonds. And their risk levels influence asset allocation and yield expectations. Finally, I'd like to talk about geopolitical risks. So geopolitical factors refer to events or conditions tied to international relations, political instability, or conflict. These include war and military conflict, trade disputes or tariffs. You definitely see that on the world stage. Political upheaval or regime changes. So if a country is undergoing a civil war, or international sanctions, maybe a country has done something bad and a lot of other countries then try to punish it by imposing sanctions. The impacts on the markets. This increases market volatility and investor uncertainty. This can disrupt global supply chains, for example, energy or semiconductors, and this may trigger flight to safety in assets like gold, U.S. treasuries, or defensive sectors. So why this matters to advisors? Geopolitical risk management is part of strategic and tactical asset allocation. A diversified portfolio may help reduce the exposure to geopolitical shocks. So if you've got a nice diversified portfolio, that can help you weather some of these geopolitical storms. So let's recap this lesson real quick. So today we covered critical basic economic concepts that are going to be tested on the Series 65 exam. The business cycle shows the expansion and contraction of the economy and helps guide investment timing. Monetary and fiscal policies are tools that governments use to influence economic growth and stability. And then global factors, including currency movements, sovereign debt, and geopolitical risks, are essential considerations in portfolio management and investment planning. So these concepts don't just show up in textbooks, they influence in the real world how advisors make recommendations every single day. All right, so that's a lot of good content. Let's go ahead and let you quiz yourself to make sure you are ready to move on to the next lesson. All right, let's start out with some multiple choice questions. Which phase of the business cycle is typically associated with rising interest rates and inflation concerns? Is it A, expansion, B, trough, C, contraction, or D, recession? In this case, the answer is A. That's when we're worried about rising interest rates and inflation. Which of the following is a tool of monetary policy? A, corporate tax rates, B, government spending on infrastructure, C, open market relations, or D, trade tariffs? So monetary policy, open market relations is the only one that is a tool of monetary policy. A government increasing spending and cutting taxes is an example of A, contractionary monetary policy, B, expansionary fiscal policy, C, expansionary monetary policy, or D, tight fiscal policy. So here the answer is B, expansionary fiscal policy. So this is the government doing it. Who is primarily responsible for implementing monetary policy in the United States? Is it A, the Department of Commerce, B, the Federal Reserve, C, Congress, or D, the Internal Revenue Service? In this case, it's B, the Federal Reserve. They are responsible for all of those things. A rising debt-to-GDP ratio in a country mostly directly impacts A, exchange-traded funds, B, sovereign credit ratings, C, stock dividends, or D, bank reserve requirements. In this case, it's the sovereign credit rating. It's the country's credit rating that's going to take a hit if that debt-to-GDP ratio goes in an unfavorable direction. A strong U.S. dollar would most likely A, encourage more U.S. exports, B, make U.S. exports more expensive, C, reduce demand for imported goods, or D, hurt U.S. exporters. The answer is D. It's going to hurt U.S. exporters if the dollar is strong. So which of the following events is considered a geopolitical risk? A, a central bank raising rates, B, a multinational company launching an IPO, C, a trade war between two major economies, or D, a company restating earnings. So in this case, it's C, a trade war between two major economies. Yeah, that's going to be a very large geopolitical risk. It's on the world stage. Which policy tool is used to manage short-term interest rates directly? Is it A, capital gains taxes, B, open market operations, C, treasury bond issuance, or D, import tariffs? In this case, the answer is B, open market operations. Which global factor most directly affects an investor that's holding foreign assets? Is it A, U.S. monetary policy, B, currency exchange rates, C, the federal budget, or D, unemployment rates? The answer is B. It's those currency exchange rates. So if you hold those foreign assets, the currency exchange rate has a larger impact on your investment. And finally, for this section of the test, if a country is experiencing a recession, which of the following might it use to stimulate growth? A, increase interest rates, B, cut government spending, C, raise taxes, or D, lower reserve requirements? So in this case, the only thing that's going to help the economy grow is by lowering those reserve requirements, D, so the banks don't have to hold as much in reserve, they can lend more out to investors. That can help get the economy going again. Which of the following is the most effective way to address weak areas in your study? A, skip them and focus on the strong areas. B, increase time spent reviewing those topics. C, avoid practice exams. Or D, study only on weekends. In this case, it's B. You want to increase the time spent reviewing those topics. If you can make your weak spots into your strong spots, then you should be okay when you take the exam. What is one reason to take full-length practice exams? A, to memorize answers, B, to avoid using a study guide, C, to build test endurance and identify weak areas, or D, to learn regulatory definitions only. So here the correct answer is C, to build test endurance and identify weak areas so that you can work on them in the future. All right, so now I'm going to ask you a few open-ended questions before we finish with this lesson. The first one is, why is it important for investment advisors to understand the business cycle? So there are many things you could say here, but here's an example response. So understanding the business cycle helps advisors make informed investment decisions and recommendations. For example, during economic expansions, growth stocks may outperform, while in contractions, defensive sectors like utilities may offer more stability. So it's really important to understand these things. How does fiscal policy differ from monetary policy, and why does that matter to investors? So fiscal policy is controlled by the government and involves taxation and spending, while monetary policy is managed by the central bank and influences interest rates and money supply. Each one of these impacts economic growth and market performance a little differently, which in turn affects asset prices and investment returns. Finally, one last question. What is the significance of currency valuation when managing an international portfolio? What would you say to that? So, for example, currency valuation affects the real return of foreign investments. A strong dollar can reduce returns from foreign assets when converted back to US dollars, while a weaker dollar may enhance them. Advisors must consider the risk when diversifying globally. All right, how did you do? If you felt like, hey, I'm doing great, then it's probably time to move on to the next lesson. However, if you're still feeling a little like, oh, I didn't really get all of that, or you didn't do very well in the multiple choice, or weren't able to answer those open answer questions, then yeah, you might need to go review before moving on to the next lesson. Our next lesson will be inflation, interest rates, and key economic indicators. But that is all for our lesson for today. Thank you very much for listening.